Good evening. Welcome to the Richmond Literature Festival and to this session on making up the past. My name is Russell Schechter. I am the program director for creative writing at St. Mary's University. And it's really good to see you. Well, sort of. You know what I mean. You're out there somewhere. I know you are. I can't see you, but I can sense you. We can feel your interest and your good vibrations, and we're very happy that you have come to join us here in this rather unusual way of doing a panel. Virtual life is a bit of what we've got at the moment, but we will make the most of it. We are not going to let some silly little apocalyptic pandemic get in the way of an interesting session talking about books, talking about writing, talking about historical fiction, because that is what we have on the agenda tonight. I feel really lucky to be here tonight, really fortunate to be hosting this with two such talented writers, two debut novelists who I had the very good fortune of working with on at St. Mary's. We have an MA called Writing the First Novel, and both of these writers began their projects on our MA a few years back, and have carried on and taken the books to publication, which is absolutely brilliant, and just, you know, just a delight for me personally, but more so for you as readers who are interested in good novels and interesting novels. The plan for tonight is we're going to have a little chat. Both of our writers, don't worry, I will introduce you properly in a moment. Both of our writers are going to offer a brief reading from their novels, and we will have a chat and some questions. But you also have the opportunity to ask some questions as well. You can hopefully this will all work. The tech has been brilliant so far, and the people behind it are absolutely wonderful. You can type in some questions and they will get passed on to me, and we'll save some time at the end for questions that people type in. So but if at any point you have a question, go ahead and type it into the chat, and we will get to them at the end. But we have two very talented novelists here, both of whom writing historical fiction, two books which are very different from each other. They are alike only in their quality and in their remarkable readability, I would say. I think but each of the two writers, each of the two books looks at some key moments of 20th century and inching into 21st century history, detailing them in really wonderful ways, bringing these periods to life, bringing the characters to life. We have with us Louise Fein, who could, yeah, wave, Louise, and whose book People Like Us was published in the UK by Head of Zeus back in August, not very long ago, just a couple of months ago. I should mention it was also published in the US with a different title, Daughter of the Reich. And it is set in 1930s Germany, and it's a kind of I suppose an impossible love story about, told and primarily about a young German girl, Hetty, who is the daughter of a high, fast-rising Nazi official, and her impossible love for a Jewish boy and his travails during the same period. Molly Gartland is here, who is the author of Girl from the Hermitage, published just last month by Lightning Books. And Girl from the Hermitage is a view of a woman's journey through basically 75 years of Russian history, starting at the siege of Leningrad and leading up right up pretty much to the present day to Putin's oligarchy. Taking her, and she's an artist, a painter, seeing her journey through this rather remarkable period. And we thought it might be nice to start out the evening with a little reading from Molly from girl from the Hermitage, just to give you a bit of a taste of her talent.
Okay. So I'll read a bit where the main protagonist, Galina, she paints the portrait, which is a real portrait that I own. And this is the scene where she actually paints that portrait. They make their way to a grassy field. The sun is much stronger without the protection of the trees. Galina squints in the bright light. Several low concrete walls along the water's edge form pens for the geese. Sveta, Galina calls, sit here. Sveta perches on the edge of the wall. Behind her, hundreds of geese lazily swim, dipping their heads below the water and lifting them out again. The orange ribbons in her hair match the color of the geese bills exactly, and her hair shines in the sun. It's perfect. Galina slides the easel from her shoulder, extends the legs, and flips open the box. She rests the cardboard on the easel and tightens the screws, fixing it in place. She presses the paint tubes firmly, winding them from the bottom, creating an arc of color along the upper edge of the wooden palette. Taking a narrow, round brush from the box, she looks at Sveta closely. Galina mixes raw umber, a bit of solvent, and the paint thins, leaving only a hint of pigment on the brush. The sun seeps through her cotton painting smock, warming her back. How long will it take? Sveta asks sweetly. We'll take a break for lunch in an hour. Just try to relax. Should I smile? You don't have to. I'll tell you when I'm doing your face. Her brush dances, partnered with the symphony of the squawking geese. The languid ebb and flow of their movements puts her in a trance as she focuses her attention on the emerging portrait. Sveta, peaceful and innocent, sits with her hands folded on her lap. Galina wants to capture the freshness of childhood, the simplicity of the moment, the promise of the future.
Brilliant, thank you. I wonder if, to start off, you could talk a little bit. It's interesting. You just said something about you owning the portrait that's you're describing in the book. Could you say a bit about the origins of this story, of this character, what it is that led you to write this particular book?
Yeah. So I lived in Moscow for 6 years, from 94 to 2000. And towards the end of my stay, my husband and I saw this portrait, and we just liked it. And it was of a young girl with lots of geese behind her. And we loved the portrait, so we bought it. And it's hung in our house for years. And then about 6 years ago, I was Googling about the artist. I never knew anything about the artist. And I came across a biography of her. And it turns out she had survived the siege of Leningrad and was still painting. So she's in her 80s and she's still alive and painting today. And so I just started looking at this painting differently and thinking how remarkable it was that this woman lived through such tremendous change in her country. And I just thought it was an interesting angle for a novel. And so I just took a very small handful of facts of her real life and created a completely fictional story. It's very little of it is her real story.
That's very interesting. Did you talk to her at all in terms of preparing for the novel, writing the novel?
Yes. So what's strange is when I found a biography of her, the picture of my portrait popped up on the screen, and it turns out the study for my portrait hangs in a gallery in the town where she lives, Ekaterinburg. And so through them, I did try to send her a letter, and the manager of the gallery, he was, when I called him, and in my pidgin English, my pidgin Russian, you know, I tell him that I have this portrait and I wanted to contact her, and he said he would pass her the letter. But then at the time I was in a beginning creative writing class at our ACC, and I could just hear my creative writing teacher saying, why would you want to talk to her when you could just create a story? And so I didn't pursue contacting her, and it's only recently that I've gotten in touch. She's on WhatsApp, so you can WhatsApp her. And I had to get permission.
From the siege of Leningrad to WhatsApp.
Yeah, she's on WhatsApp, and so I needed to get permission to put a picture of the portrait on my website, and so she agreed to that, and she's lovely. She's absolutely exactly what I pictured her to be. She's very feisty, and when I said to her, "Do you remember this portrait?" because she did it in '79. And she's like, "Of course I remember it. It's my work." You know, she was quite very confident and plucky. Exactly what I thought she'd be.
That raises some interesting questions that I sort of want to come back to in a minute. But I think just turn to Louise and sort of ask you the same question, if I may. We'll hear a little reading from you a bit later on. But could you say a little bit about how you came to write the book that you did? What drew you to this story? A little bit about its origins and how it came about.
Sure. Well, my father was from Nazi Germany. He left as a refugee in the early 30s, and I was a product of his second marriage. So I had an English mother. I was brought up very much as an English child, and he never spoke really about his background. So as I grew into adulthood, I wanted to find out more about it because he had died when I was only 17. So it was always there, something I wanted to explore. And equally, I'd also wanted to always be a writer. So I suppose the first book I was going to write was always going to be about that sort of subject. So I had just a really, really vague idea of a story. Which was basically about a German girl and a Jewish boy falling in love, and how could that be at that time? And that was it, just the smallest idea. And yeah, it grew from that really. And when I saw the Masters advertised, it was really the kickstart that got me going. So it really grew from there, from just a tiny thread of an idea.
Okay, I mean, this session is built because of the books you've written, being about historical fiction, and I'd like to sort of focus on that aspect of things for a little bit, if that makes sense. And Molly, you tweeted. You both have Twitter accounts. Everybody tweets. I noticed you tweeted, it was either yesterday or a couple of days ago, a quote from another writer, I think of historical fiction. And the quote that you tweeted is talking about historical fiction. It's the closest thing we have to time travel. Well-written historical fiction makes the reader feel like they're living in the past rather than just reading about it. Mm-hmm. And I thought it's actually quite a good, quite an interesting little line and useful line about it. And I wonder, historical fiction feels like a big thing to take on, especially for a first novel. Where do you begin once you know you want to write a historical novel? How do you make the reader feel like they're living there, which I think you both do. I think that's one of the great things about both books. You really do feel the periods that you're writing about. How do you do that rather than just reading about? Molly?
Well, my book, I always knew I wanted it in the 4 time periods. And so, you know, the 41, the 79 when she paints the portrait, the 99 when she sells it, and then a modern section. So when I looked at it that way, I knew the 90s and I knew now. So actually, I just needed to find out about Siege of Leningrad and then better understand a Soviet, not such a cliched Soviet picture, which I think is what a lot of people in the West have. So the Siege of Leningrad, there is lots of documentaries and interviews of, especially with people who were children during the siege and still living now or in recent times. So that I found a lot of information. There's brilliant documentaries as well. There's a Dutch documentary called 900 Days, and that was really, really important. So the siege, there was quite a lot of information, and I think when you're writing historical fiction, you still focus on the characters and the relationships between the people, and the actual historic fact is you read 10 million times more than what you put in the book. You know, most of it doesn't go in the book. And then also in this book was some sort of flashback into Stalin, the 30s, and that sort of thing. That came about in the writing process. So then that was another layer that I had to research. But then also in the process, Svetlana Alexievich, her books were brilliant because all of that is, many of her books are about the transition from into the Soviet and into all the changes and the impact that's had on real people. So once you start researching and breaking it down and knowing that you don't need to be an expert, you just need enough to make it believable, but you do have to read a lot more than what you put in the book.
Louise, I wonder if you can sort of talk about your approach to that, or how you dealt with that, the research aspect of it, how you find authenticity for a historical novel, how you paint that backdrop. I think Molly's point about it's the characters and maybe talk more about that in a minute, but the characters ultimately are front and center, and that's what really drives. But you've got to have that background, and if you haven't, it's a different era, you haven't lived there yourself. How did you approach that aspect of the book?
Yeah, I agree with Molly. You 99% of the reading I did has not gone into the book, but I started off with just general reading, fact and fiction, and I also listened to contemporaneous. I read as much contemporaneous material as I could get my hands on. Some of that was published. Some of it was actually family archives. I was lucky that there were 24 boxes of family papers that went all the way back to about 1906, which was an amazing resource. But even without that, with the internet these days, you can find out so much. Talking to people as well. Obviously, if you're writing about Elizabethan England, that's not going to work. But if it's 20th century, there are still people who remember. There are, tape recordings as well. I listened to some audio recordings of people recalling their childhood growing up in Nazi Germany. So it was a variety of things. I also travelled to Leipzig, which is where the book is set, a few times, and I interviewed people over there, met people who lived there. So it wasn't that I did that all up front. I did some general reading, wrote the story, and then from the story I narrowed it down to certain aspects that needed to be researched in more detail. Because I think if you just think, oh, I want to write a story, I have to find everything out about, I don't know, Germany in 1910, that's a massive general subject, and you could go down all sorts of rabbit holes. So having the story actually as your starting point is quite useful, I think.
I think the other thing, the more nonfiction I read, the more ideas I had for the story. So lots of things in the book are things that were real, things that really happened to other people. So all that reading, it does give you ideas of what to do with the story.
And actually for my book, it was really important to me to get as much historical detail correct. It doesn't always have to be, it is fiction, but that was important to me for the authenticity. And so I did base it around real events that had happened. My characters are false, but all the places, all the events actually took place, or I read about things, incidents that happened, and then I adapted them for my story. So yes, it's a very rich, doing the research gives you all sorts of material to work with.
It raises a couple of questions. One, I remember speaking to another historical novelist, Christie Dickinson, who writes largely about England in sort of 16th and 17th century. And she's written 6 or 7 books sort of set in that, roughly that period. And she's a meticulous researcher. And one of the things she talks about is always going, obviously she doesn't have a time machine, she's not the doctor, but going to the places that she's writing about, just to walk around them today, to get a feel of, to go, she sort of knew what it was like. It had maps or some, diaries of what it was like then, but wanted to know what it's actually like to walk from the seaside to the castle on the hill. How does it feel physically to be part? And I wonder if that was important to you, the fact that Molly, you lived in it was Russia at that point, right, for several years, and Louise, you went to Leipzig to soak up some of the feel of the place. Is that fair?
Yeah, I did. I walked around. I must have walked absolutely miles. I did exactly that. I walked from place to place. And actually, obviously it's more modern history, but there was a lot of buildings that I could see, and I walked to what I thought might have been a more industrial area, and you could still see the ruins of brick buildings that were clearly factories. And if you keep your eyes peeled, there's a lot you can pick up. Just the walls of the city were there, and or remnants of them. Places like the zoo was there then and now. So there was a lot of detail just from walking around the place that you can pick up, and old pictures as well, which you can find a lot of online. Obviously, travel at the moment is tricky, but you can still find old maps. I spent a lot of time actually looking at street names because they changed so much over the time period, and I don't know why it meant a lot to me to get that right, but having the characters running around the city in one scene, I wanted to make sure it was right.
Molly, how did your time living in Russia play into your ability to construct this novel?
I couldn't have written this novel without the experience of living there. I just don't think it wouldn't have occurred to me. So definitely, I mean, and it's funny because Petersburg, I've been there a few times, but I know Moscow much better. But yeah, it was Google and Google Maps and old maps, and it just, you can find the information, and you can ask people too, because like you said, when you find people that are knowledgeable, and then they're happy to help as well.
Yeah.
And that there were several Russians and an artist who was very, very helpful in my book.
The other question which came to mind as you were just talking was, what's the balance between being true to history and being true to the story that you want to tell? I think you both talked about, you did way more research than obviously appears in the books. I think that makes sense. But I've also, and I'm sure you have as well, I've read historical fiction, or even, it doesn't have to be historical fiction, where you can see all the research that the author did. And the author was going to make sure that the reader knew just how much they suffered to do the research for this book. And it's a disaster for the book, because you don't want to see the research. You want the story. But at the same time, there are issues of authenticity. There are issues of being true, especially the kinds of periods you are both dealing with. And I wonder, Louise, are there particular demands, do you think, in that regard? I mean, you're dealing with incredibly sensitive and difficult time. It's not a Holocaust novel, but it's the period leading up to the Holocaust. It's right up to that point, effectively. And do you think there were any particular worries that you had, or demands that you felt upon you telling such a story in that era, versus the things you needed to do to tell the story and get the characters across the way you wanted to do so?
Yeah, I definitely felt a big pressure and responsibility, particularly because I'm telling the story from the perspective of a Nazi girl. So she, at the beginning of the book, has, to what a modern reader will feel, is some very reprehensible views. And it was always going to be a challenge to keep my reader wanting to read the book when, her views are really quite unpleasant. So to me, the story is absolutely the central, key, most important part of it, because if somebody wanted to read a book about the Holocaust, they could go and pick up any factual book, but this is about the story, and it's about engaging emotions, which is what happens through your characters. So yes, there were ways that I had to adapt it to make it, work in a book. So for instance, at that time in Germany, you would have sat around a dinner table and not spoken to anybody, and I had conversations happening around my dinner table. Otherwise it would have been a very dull book. So yeah, there are things that you need to change, but they're not important things.
I wonder, Molly, sort of the same question, because I mean, your book does move across very different periods, historical periods, for the Soviet Union and for Russia. But certainly the opening, very, very effective opening quarter part of the book, which is the siege of Leningrad, which is quite brutal and quite awful. Obviously historically awful, but awful for the characters as well. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think you definitely want it to be authentic, and you want to bring an angle to it that hasn't kind of been looked at before. I think also, and honestly, I have a very good friend in Russia, and I would often speak to her, so she knew I was writing this book. And I could hear it in her voice that she didn't want me to write this book, to be honest. Russians are a lot like Americans, very proud and very protective of what is their history, a very messy history, like all countries, So I really felt a responsibility, that it needed to be reflective of these people and this time. And whether or not they would have had this pair of shoes or not, or whatever, tiny little minutia, but you wanted it to be respectful to a country that isn't my own. And I remember when the publisher said they wanted to publish the book, my first feeling was, you know, was shock horror, you know, that this is going to be put out into the world, you know, because you're thinking it can't be right, it can't be good enough, it can't be enough. But you know, you give it to more Russian readers, you have them go through it, and then the confidence builds. But I felt that responsibility very strongly. When it isn't your own culture specifically, I think it's important to get it right.
You just alluded to something a couple of minutes ago, which I thought was one of the really interesting things about the book. Lots of interesting things about the book, but one thing which really struck me was the way you present the country and the people in it, which is what I really enjoyed was the fact that you do avoid cliches in the book about, especially from a Western point of view, about the Soviet Union, about Russia. And I think the politics of it are interesting because your Galina is, she loves her country, and she, even though there's recognition of some awful things, I'm talking not necessarily thinking about the siege of Stalin, I think of some of the later sections. She doesn't take a Western American line, if you will, if you know what I mean, on those events. And I think that makes it feel like a much more believable and much more complex story.
Yeah, and a lot of that came through, you know, in the various documentaries or the Svetlana Alexievich books. That was a recurring theme of just the pride, and it is. I tried to draw a parallel to it being like a mother's love. You forgive your children a lot, you know, and it's just the way it is, you know. And I think that it's an interesting perspective that I just in the research it came through quite often, these themes, and so it was something I wanted to include.
I wonder, we'll move on to something different in a minute, but just sort of one more thing in this line. And I mean, Molly, you're basing it on a real person. Obviously, it's not you've created a character just inspired by that. But Louise as well. I mean, you're dealing with also real historical figures, people who exist. Okay, they can't. They're dead now. They can't sue you, but and you know, Nazis don't have a great reputation to sue off of anyway. But what issues are there with, what problems, what questions does it pose to write using real people, mixing your own invented characters with real historical figures?
Yeah, it's it was quite challenging, and I think you have to be quite careful if you're going to use real figures to make sure that you have all the background detail correct. So, you know, newspaper articles, dates, the actual events have to be correct. Otherwise, if you have your historical character, for instance, in the wrong town on a wrong year, or, you know, they didn't hold that position at that time, I think you're getting yourself into trouble. But as long as you have all those correct and you know kind of what sort of character you're talking about, then you can use that, because, you know, nobody knows what happened behind scenes at and certain meetings, or you know, in governments or whatever. So I think the further back you go, the more you can invent things. If it's quite recent history, I think you have to be very, very careful to get that right.
Molly, any thoughts along these lines?
Yeah, in my book, there's only one real character, and that's the director of the Hermitage, and that's it. So the rest are just of my own development. Although some of the people in the 90s section are based on real people, but then they changed into other people. But so it isn't, I didn't have the well-known figures, but I agree that I think it gives you more latitude if you're using completely fictional characters than if you're doing someone who's known.
Let me just ask one more question, then I think we'll give Louise a chance to read a selection from people like us. One thing that's just really impossible to not notice in both books are the locales, and I think that the importance of the cities involved in this. I think both Petersburg and Leipzig are absolutely essential parts of to both of these books. I think they're almost characters in the books, and I wonder how do you feel about the settings and their role in the stories that you tell? Whoever wants to go first.
I take that as a real compliment, because I didn't know Leipzig at all, and when I visited there, I fell in love with it. I thought it was the most beautiful city. And I just imagined my characters living their life in this place. And I think place is important. I mean, these characters knew nothing else apart from that place. And we are all part and parcel of where we come from. The history that surrounds us, the character of the people, it all is wound up in one thing. So it was important. It's only set in Leipzig. There's no other places in my book. So I'm pleased that you saw it that way, because for me it became a key part of the story.
Yeah, and I agree that. So I spent a summer in St. Petersburg, the summer of '93, on like a student exchange study program. So I had memories of that and my impression of that. And then I had been a couple of times more like as a tourist, but again, that it was in the 90s that I had been there. So it had been a long time. But also in my book, it's all in the city, and then there's a bit in the dacha, and that I based that on a real dacha that I had been to. And it's funny because long after I wrote the book, I came across some photographs of this day that I had gone to this dacha, and it would have been really helpful to have, but I just didn't realize I had these photos. But I think the place was just really important to get it right, the setting it, and it's wonderful to hear that you think it's like a character in the book, because it should be.
Yeah, no, I think for both books it's really central and works really well for both stories. I wonder if this is a reasonable point to ask Louise to grace us with a little reading, a little excerpt from People Like Us.
I'm just going to read a little chunk right from the beginning of the book. So at the very beginning, Hetty is quite young. She's a small child. She's only 7. But it sets up, it's quite an important part of what happens later in the book. Summer 1929. The lake is silky smooth, lapping gently around the legs of the jetty. The knobbly planks beneath my toes are thick and warmed by the sun. Carl is on the bank, wriggling into his shorts under the towel Muti is holding around him. Careful, Hetty, Carl shouts. The water's deep out there. I'm just looking, I call back. I want to see the big fish. I shuffle right to the very end and curl my toes around the edge. Crouching low, I peer into the water. I can't see the bottom of the lake. Maybe there isn't one. Perhaps the dark green water goes all the way down to the middle of the earth where savage monsters lurk, waiting. Walter swims towards the jetty. He splashes his arms, then around, then floats on his back, pale toes bobbing up out of the water. He pops up again, grinning at me, pushing his wet hair off his face. I wish I could have swimming lessons like Carl. Then I too could glide like a fish, instead of splashing about in the shallows, stubbing my toes on jagged stones and slipping on slimy weed. From my perch, I watch Walter swim further out into the lake. He disappears from sight, hidden by the solid wooden pillar of the jetty. I move to try to see him, but I lean too far and topple forward. My hands fly out, clawing at empty space, and I'm falling down, down, down. Belly first, I crash into the stone-hard surface. I gasp with the iciness, but instead of air, there is only rancid lake water. Help, I splutter, splashing hopelessly, blinded by blurry flashes of light and dark. Help, louder now, but the water boils and churns, closing over my head, and the monsters suck me down to their deep green lair. Gripped by panic, I scrabble and kick, fighting back up to the surface. I manage a breath. There are voices in the distance. I thrash wildly, but it doesn't keep me up, and I'm swirling round and round. The voices fade as I'm dragged down again, lungs screaming, but the water, sickening, cloying, heavy, fills them, and I'm drowning. Darkness folds in.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that. Just again, a reminder to those lovely people out there in the dark. Feel free to type in any questions you might have to the chat, and if you do have some, I realize it's a slightly cumbersome way to pose questions, but if you have any, feel free to do so. I can't resist being the creative writing teacher that I am. Can't resist trying to ask you a few questions, sort of poking under the hood a little bit, if you don't mind, of the books. I hope you'll forgive me, or more importantly, I hope the people who are watching will forgive me. Hearing you read that sequence really brings us to the fore. I wonder about Louise. You tell this book in first person point of view, and I think people who haven't yet read it got a real good sense of that voice from the selection that you read. And Molly, you wrote the book from third person point of view. I wonder, Louise, maybe you can start. Could you talk a little bit about the choice of that voice, how you came to that voice, how difficult was it if it was, to find that voice?
Well, as you know, Russell, it was quite difficult to find that voice at the beginning, because I wrote the whole book in the third person. And actually I had more than one point of view, but it wasn't really working, and Hetty wasn't completely inhabited. I had feedback telling me Hetty wasn't completely inhabited. So I experimented and switched to first person. And it made such a big difference. It just kind of took off from there. And I think being in first person, I was so much closer to her, and I was living the story through her. So it was a good choice for this particular book. Yeah.
I mean, and Molly, you. In some ways, your story, it feels like it could have been told in first person. I'm not saying it should have, because it works perfectly in third person. But could you say a little bit about the decisions you made in that regard, the choice to write it in that particular voice?
Yeah, it's a very close third person. So you're very much in the head of the point of view character. So the first quarter is in the viewpoint of the protagonist's father, and then the rest of it is in Galina's perspective. And I really wanted it to be his perspective in the beginning, not hers, because I wanted the reader to know more than Galena ever would. That there's certain things that Galena doesn't know that the reader knows. And I think that is the way life is, you know. So, and I think the voice, it just came, it just evolved. And also because I was doing such a big time jump, her view had to be very different for each of those time periods. So a 40 something, and then her later life, and then as a 80 something, it all had to sound different in order for it to be believable.
Well, you have absolutely anticipated the next question I was going to ask, which is, because again, both books unfold across periods of time.
Mm-hmm.
Molly, your book over a much greater period of time, as you mentioned, 1941, 1979, 1999, 2016, which is effectively present day for all intents and purposes. Which obviously encompasses huge changes in Russian history and world history. Louise, your book unfolds across not quite as broad a period of time, but you read us a bit of the prologue, which is 1929. The bulk of the story takes place between 1933 and 1939. And without any spoilers, there is an epilogue which takes place many years after the fact. Any particular, Molly? I think you've alluded to it slightly. I'm somewhat interested. Obviously, it's clear why you chose the first period that you chose, the siege of, you know, that's when the siege was. So that's what you're going to do. But could you talk a little bit more about issues of having a story unfold over such a, and I think you do it very well. I think she is believable at those different ages.
Mm-hmm.
But I can imagine it posing problems as a writer to bring that to life across those different times. Any thoughts or observations about that process?
Yeah, I think because my original idea was with the portrait, and it just kind of, that created a skeleton of the book, this shift in time periods. And so when I started looking into that time period, so the painting being painted at a time, I think the real painting is actually 77, but I moved it to 79 so that it was closer to the beginning of the Afghan war. So again, in the research, you suddenly realize, oh yeah, Afghanistan. And that was a big turning point, similar to the Vietnam experience in America. So people's relationship with the government, it was a big turning point. So I don't know, you just find a way to bring these time periods together.
Well, I was going to say a question to the end, but a question just came up, which is exactly what you're talking about at the moment. So perhaps I'll present it to you now. The question says, Molly, you said that the second part of the book, set in 1979, was a challenge because it was before your experience. Can you say anything about what you discovered about Russian life in that period, which took you beyond the cliched view of communist Russia that most Westerners have?
You know, for that, actually, I turned to fiction of the time, and Dovlatov. I became a fan of Dovlatov, and he has this very kind of cynical, absurd humor of the whole situation of things. And I found that really insightful, an interesting aspect. So that really helped. And then it was talking to people. I remember talking to a friend about how, you know, currently in Russia, there's a big glorifying of the Soviet past, and people glorifying it. And she's from a town in Belarusia, and she just looked at me and she said, there wasn't anything to eat. you know, for her, it was very cut and dried. There was just such a narrow selection of food available that she just couldn't understand it and had no time for it. So a lot of the 70s, I could talk to friends who gave me their own feelings of that time period. So even if it went into the 80s a bit, it was still, you could talk to people about it. But fiction really helped too, the Devlata.
I was just going to add something to what Molly said then was, I think humor is a really good insight to a time period, because the joke, I even have some real jokes in my book. One of my characters has a very bad sense of humor and always telling terrible jokes. And but the jokes actually are quite important because they reflect the humor of the time. And you know, if you think now about, I don't know, Trump jokes or whatever, people were joking about Hitler or you know, various people who were high up in the government, or I think it gives you quite an insight into how people were really talking amongst themselves. So that was just what I wanted to add.
Well, I wonder, just going back to sort of the original question for Louise about, again, the issue of the elapsed time taking place. And in some ways, I mean, you had slightly different problems, issues to address. For Molly, it's this girl, then this woman at very different ages, you know, across an entire lifetime. But you have to sort of, you have to make us believe and follow the maturation of a girl into adulthood, essentially, maybe forced a little bit earlier than anyone would like. But you have to, and I think you do it, make convincing across time this girl getting older at a very, very key stage. Any thoughts about that process of trying to develop her in that way?
Yeah, well, partly I chose to have her as quite young because she was an artsy. It was easier to get a reader's sympathy with her because she was so young. Being a young child, you can't really blame her for having the views that she does have at the beginning of the book. And as she matures, obviously, she begins to question those beliefs. I think I really struggled with the early stages because she was so young, and it is an adult book, so it's having a young protagonist without it sounding too childish but still authentic was the trouble at the early stages of the book. And then obviously her voice matures as we get into the later stages. Well, the early part is actually the shortest part, and it took a lot of rewriting to get that right. But yeah, it was interesting for me actually to grow with my characters, because some of their behaviors is totally explained by what happened to them as children, as it is in life. And so in some ways it was useful, and in other ways it was a challenge.
You have, again, with no pre-planning, we've never met before, I don't know you. You have led perfectly into the next question I wanted to ask, which is, and you, I mean, you know, we did classes together some years ago, but what I say to creative writing students all the time, and it's the most obvious thing, but it's also the most important thing. Books, stories live or die based on characters. Story, plot is important, and style, and all. I mean, I'm not, you know, there's lots of elements to writing, but ultimately, books succeed or fail. Okay, in my humble opinion, or not so humble. Sorry, everybody. Books succeed or fail depending on how rich the characters are, how much the reader cares about, engages with. I'm not saying likes is a different. That's a whole. That's not the point. But how much you can engage with the characters. And to me, the success, let's say, I think both books have lots of things to recommend them. So everybody's gonna go buy copies, right? Yeah, all you people out there. Both books have lots of things to recommend them. But ultimately, each of these books succeeds because of the characters. And I think, you just sort of alluded to this a little bit, Louise. I'll start with you on this very long-winded question. Sorry. Were there particular difficulties? I mean, Hetty's a wonderful character, and I like all the characters in the book. I mean, I like the ones I hate, you know. But are there particular issues writing about Nazis? You know, that's an extra challenge there, isn't there?
Yeah, because I think also when it's a period that has been written about so much, and you know, there is, I don't know how many books set in that period of time, and films, and you know, everything. It's very easy to fall into stereotypes, and I remember struggling with this quite early on, and a very wise tutor said to me. You know, your characters have to be human, and actually even some of my worst characters in their own heads, they are, of course, you know, they're right, they are heroes in their own world. So so just remembering that and making them all, you know, human and normal whilst doing horrible things is quite important to avoid those stereotypes.
And Molly, I mean, you've talked about this a little bit so far, but again, you got this character who is, you know, going from, is it 8 to 83? If I got,
yeah.
I think that's right, isn't it? Yeah. Which is quite a task to set for yourself to make her believable and multidimensional and fleshed out across that time. Did you find it difficult to write? Was it? Let me put it the other way. Was it easier to write her at some ages than at others?
I think the 90s was very easy to write because I was so familiar with it. But you know, I would think of people that I know, and so you know, I thought of my friend's mother, and when I would get stuck, I would think, what would Nina Ivanovna do? And put myself in her shoes. And then there was always, you know, in all of these interviews that I watched and in the Svetlana Alexievich oral histories, there were just little nuggets where you just think that one line is really revealing about this woman's character and her experience. And I use those things. So much of what's in the book is not my imagination. It's things that happened. And so I think that helped. But I would think of, you know, I have a friend here in London, and, you know, I know it's difficult for the parent to come and visit. And so I know you can imagine it, you know, in just little bits of people that you actually know. You can bring them into the character and create a character.
Mm-hmm. I'm just looking at my watch, being aware that I think people can only Zoom for so long, and I think it's been very interesting. But I there's at least one other question here. But before I get to that, you've both written for your debuts. You've written historical novels. As I said at the start, I think that's an enormous challenge for a first novelist to set for themselves. I think it's a challenge for any novelist to set for themselves. I think it's a particular challenge for a first novel. You've both been successful. You've had your books published. Yay! I'm so happy. What about second novel? Do you have second novels in the works? Are you going to do, would you do another historical novel? Do you have other things in mind? Could you say a little bit about your plans for book number 2? Louise, you want to start?
Yeah, well, book number 2 is already written, actually.
Aha!
And it's being published in England next September, and in America next October. It's called The Hidden Child. And it's set in 1920s England this time, a little bit easier on the language front. And it's a little bit about the eugenics movement that took place in England and America at that time. And it's about a sort of up-and-coming couple who are very much supporters of the eugenics movement, and they have a child who turns out not to be quite as perfect as they'd like.
Sounds very interesting. I shall look forward to that. Molly, are you working on a second book? Plans for a second book?
Yes, I'm not as far along as Louise, regrettably, but I'm trying to do one that is set during the Russian Revolution. And so I've been doing a lot of research over the summer, and I've just recently got to writing. But I have to say, I found 2020 very distracting, whereas Louise has been very good with her deadline. So but hopefully I get moving on it.
Well, the Russian Revolution, that's not a challenge at all, is it?
What could possibly go wrong?
I mean, Warren Beatty made a 4-hour film, and that it barely touched it. No, that sounds like a very rich vein to mine as well for a story. There are a couple of questions here, which I will from the audience, which I will ask you. One is this one is for Molly. It says, Masha was such a vivid character. Is she based on someone you know? Or do you want to say?
No, I don't think Masha was based on anyone specific, but I will say that, you know, there are people that I knew in the 90s, and then I left, and they did extremely well for themselves. And you never would have, I mean, they were normal people. They weren't, you know, I didn't expect them to end up a bag lady, but I think it was a time period that you just did not know where people would end up. And the whole Mary Kay aspect of Masha, I worked for a courier service in Russia. I worked for Pony Express, which is also in the book. But Mary Kay was one of our biggest clients. And it was just such a funny, it was just kind of funny that it was a very, very big product in Russia. And I assume it still is. So bits of Masha, but no one, she's a, you know, a collage of people.
Fair enough. You can tell me who she really is after. It's okay. And there's one other question here, which I have to say, all credit to whoever typed it in, because really the question I was more or less going to finish on, or close enough to it, I think. And the question says, looking back, if you had to advise yourself of one thing you learned in writing your book, which you wished you knew at the time, what would that be? What do you wish you could go back and tell yourself? Oh, I don't know a few years ago, let's say, or when you started these projects. Louise?
I think I wish I'd known just to keep going. There were many times when I sort of partially gave up and shoved it away and thought it was never going to come to anything. And I think if you just keep plugging away day by day by day, you get there. And not to worry if you know you've written something and you go back the next day or something and it's not that good. It's okay, because you can always change it later. Whereas I would then, you know, tear it up and rewrite it and think, oh my God, I can't do this. But actually, if you just keep moving forward, you can always go back and change that much later, and not worry if it's a bit rubbish, because first drafts always are, and it's fine.
I think that's good advice. I think it's good advice. Molly, anything comes to mind for you? I
think it's the same. You know, I was listening to a podcast a couple of weeks ago with Neil Gaiman, and he said, you know, the writer who gets published and goes forward is the one who's been sitting in the chair every day, and the chair is so shiny from you sitting in it, basically. and that you have to do it, and you have to have that momentum of writing, and a forward march. Just keep march, and don't look back. And so that momentum, I think, is really an important part. And don't sweat over tiny little words and sentences, and get the arc of the story down. Get the first draft down. I would, that first draft just took forever, and I think, I'm hoping that it goes much quicker this time.
Fair enough. I think perhaps that's probably a good place to leave. Oh, yep, no more questions. I think that's probably a good place to leave off. I just want to say thank you to both Molly and Louise for coming out through the plague-ridden streets of London to be here. And I'd like to thank everybody who participated in this. We would have loved to had you here live with us, but it's great of you to have supported the festival, supported Louise and Molly. If you want to support them more, if you haven't done so, please buy a copy of their books. These are books which should be read, which deserve to be bought, which need to be supported. So by all means, please buy your copies. Order it from a local bookseller near you if you can. But wherever you get it, get copies of these excellent books. I'd just like to thank the people at the Exchange, Lizette and Nick, for their wonderful help. They've been extraordinary in doing this. We're very, very grateful to them for going out of their way to make this possible. Thanks to you, thanks to the Exchange, thanks to the festival, and I'll just say good night, everybody. Thank you very much. Take care now.
Thank you, Russell. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.